So, so yeah, hello, I'm Greg, and I'm glad some people are showing up. And I'm going to just at the start here, I want to thank Ethereal Forest for sponsoring Local DAO Summer and hosting this. And hi, hey Charles, been a while, so good to see you. Um, I'm probably going to wait a few minutes here to start doing anything like for real. But so I'm not planning actually to do personal intros, including my own, because of time constraints. So in these first few minutes, as we wait for a few other people maybe to come in whenever, if anybody would like to say hi and introduce themselves or anything such, that this would be a time to do it. I'll note also, I'm going to try to allow enough room in my presentation to have Q&A and hopefully some open discussion too. And whenever somebody does bring up a question or topic, they're certainly welcome to provide personal context for why they care about that. So that could be a way of doing a bit of, personal background, why they care about the question or the idea that they bring forward. But also feel free to open your mic right now if you'd love to say anything. I'm going to wait maybe about 2 or 3 minutes tops before I start presenting.
I can just say hey again. It's great to see you. It's been a while. Yeah, but the thing is front burner still is this what we're now calling the NAO, the Networked Adaptive Organism. So that's an updated name with Brad DeGraff, right? You remember a couple of years ago we looked at this together, and so the part that we're coming back around to activating and focusing is the governance of the network co-op, essentially the type of a new co-op that we're designing. So just wanted to mention that's a broad lens that I'm coming with. Yeah, great to be here.
Thank you. That's really good to hear, Charles, and certainly relevant to where most of my attention and energies go. I'll be talking about inclusive governance, among other things today. If anybody else wants to jump in for a second or 3, that would be cool. Yeah, go ahead.
Exunt here, also known as James in the real world. Yeah, just really excited that to see this talk, to see the title. Really looking forward to hearing about it. The open protocol concept is, or the term is one that we've been playing, that our research group has been playing with. Network adaptive. That's the first time I've heard network adaptive organism. Wow, really excited about that. not to shill my own, but our talk at 1 o'clock today. Like I'd really, if you're thinking about that, then I'd really love your input on what we
I'll see. I'm over in Europe, so it'll be late. But I do have the schedule, so I'll keep this in mind if I can make it. But we can link up anyway. I checked you out a little bit so far, and I'll put it one link. It's nao.is, and that's kind of the good entryway.
Excellent. Yeah.
But you can just take that nao.is. Yeah.
Cheers. .is. Got it.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Wow, that's really cool. My buddy Ven, or who's also in the research group, is gonna love that name. And yeah, super excited to hear your talk.
I think there's a good chance I'll sign up for some session, but I haven't got it together to tune into the calendar. But I have designs on this. I'm in touch with Christine about that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Working Together Corner is next week, and if on relatively short notice, you could jump in, that would be the perfect theme for it. But also, we don't need to be lining up with the themes piece for piece, and this is meant to be really emergent and sort of just jump in. So definitely just contact us in the Telegram, and we'll get you in.
Right on.
Love to hear that talk.
Look for that. Hey, Diogo.
Excited, Greg.
It's Greg's show, so go ahead. You
right, yeah.
Good to see you.
Hello to everybody. My name is Greg Cassel, and I'm very happy to be here. Very thankful to Ethereal Forest for putting together Local DAO Summer. And I'm here to present Inclusive Organizing, Open Protocols, and Cosmolocal Collaboration. Slightly simplified title since I submitted it in writing, but here's what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to skip a personal intro because I have so much to talk about and, more importantly, to discuss with other people here. But if you're interested, just look me up. Most of my work and info about me is available pretty quickly and easily through the links I'll share today. Feel free, as I mentioned earlier, to add personal context to any questions or ideas which you might bring forward. And so I'm going to do a general introduction and overview of inclusive organizing. I'm going to screen share most of that, and we should have time to do some Q&A when I'm done with that bit. And if time allows too, I also want to zoom in and look more closely at some of the key components in inclusive organizing, and then allow some room for discussion after that. And then a summary, some Q&A and open discussion at the end. So we'll see if we can get around to everything that we would all like to discuss today. So as part of my general introduction, I will screen share inclusive organizing diagram and some documents through most of this today. But before I do that, I want to do a bit of a general intro. And I've titled that today, What Are People and Why Should We Care About Inclusive Organizing? Okay, and this is the way I see it. It's systems thinking. A lot of people have a lot of different systems theories and systems thinking conceptions, but here's what I want to put forward today with respect to inclusive organizing and its relevance to DAOs and new ways of organizing. We are all organisms. We're individuals, families, teams, and communities who do things. In other words, we perform activities, and those activities often use different types of resources, right? And sometimes we manage or govern the use of resources, including physical resources such as land, food, shelter, and entertainment products, medical resources, and also resources such as money, and nowadays, of course, cryptocurrencies. We govern resources using projects and organizations nowadays, including DAOs, as well as territorial governments, which, of course, most of those developed centuries before telecommunications and computing came to exist. So now we have this internet, including the World Wide Web, but also many increasingly centralized platforms like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple, a whole slew of Chinese and other international companies that provide centralized platforms. And also a lot of centralized platforms in Web3, like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and some less centralized Web3 conceptions and projects. But so we do stuff, sometimes solo and together, and we use resources and we govern those resources. Well, since prehistory, we've gone through many phases of the typical forms of governance. We've gone through the ages of empires, feudalism, mercantilism, capitalism, communism, consumerism, transactionalism, and what I call late stage capitalism or financialism. Okay. Now, transactionalism, the way I define that is whenever we act like in a marketplace or an exchange place, a bazaar or whatever, when we act as if the most important thing is to get the best possible deal in a trade or a purchase, regardless of the hidden costs to workers, consumers, or to the ecosystem. Financialism is when the economy and the marketplaces are driven mainly by profit-driven investment, often short-term investment and speculative trading. And I'm pointing this out, and I'm taking some time to set the stage with this, because I know this opinion could be unpopular in some crypto and DAO circles, but I got to be very blunt about this. Financialism is cancer. Financialism exploits and ultimately destroys everything it can get control of, okay? And I think a lot of very well-meaning people who do play the game and are somewhat successful in business and sometimes in government. A lot of them do realize this, that financialism is an emergent tragedy of a commons, a tragedy of our global economy. And financialism can only end well by ending it, okay? Now, we can't just gesticulate or act outraged and wish financialism away, but we can, I believe strongly, we can ultimately outcompete it. So that brings me to the framework of inclusive organizing, which I've been developing for many years. And I believe that this framework or something like it can outcompete financialism through what I would call lean open protocols for communications and collaboration, and cosmolocalized collaboration. So I'm going to define cosmolocalism as any activity or community or relationship or interaction which is rooted in both place and purpose, okay, at any scale, a shared interest, from intimate, personal, and family relationships to global collectives with global missions, any scale, as long as these cosmolocalized relationships support our shared interests. Cosmolocalization is about recognizing who the true stakeholders are and what they're doing and building together and focusing on that. So cosmolocal means always localized, but that location can be tiny to cosmic. So cosmolocal means developing our interdependent freedom, our mutual aid networks, circular economies, and all sorts of other buzzwords. It also can include Web3, any types of decentralized technology, and it can also be based in spoken and handwritten processes. And sometimes I think ancient wisdom in small group and community relationships. So the last thing I want to do before screen sharing and guiding through what is currently in inclusive organizing is the IO disclaimer in general. Number one, I want to point out the map is never the territory, and none of IO, inclusive organizing, none of it's presented as being nature or reality. It's just meant to be simple and practical design choices, which I've made sometimes alone and sometimes through team projects, based on very strong preferences I've been developing for many years on how I want to live and how I want to relate to other people. Next part of the disclaimer, few of the IO modules seem 100% perfectly finished. Some of them are, but some of them are still skeletal in some places. There's just so much I've been trying to get to over the years. Some of them are skeletal with what I perceive to be a sound structure, but not fleshed out. Sometimes they have nearly empty sections. And I want to note IO is partly based on my experience in many team projects for about a decade now. And there are appreciative credits given in many of the IO modules or documents. And the last point I want to make is that IO is, much of it is very intentionally unoriginal. I've only diverged from normal definitions and what I perceive to be best practices when that seems important, as it sometimes does, for developing modularity and scalability. So let me screen share and share the link now. Here we go. I got to grab that link for you. All right. Well, it's been so long since I've used Google Meet. There's the chat with everyone button. All right, I just put the link in the chat window for anybody that wants to open it up directly. So when you look at this, please note, hopefully it's fitting the screen as almost fully, and all right. Please note at the top, there's a link here to Inclusive Organizing Framework, which provides background information on inclusive organizing in general, which you can look at anytime you'd like. That document includes a verbal overview of inclusive organizing and verbal overviews of many of the modules here, which are hyperlinked. All right, and we'll look at some of those directly today. Inclusive organizing as a whole, and all of the mature modules, including the ones that are directly linked here, are all open sourced. So this diagram and the linked documents here have been developing for about a decade, and my golden rules from the beginning have been to be modular, to be methodical and scalable, aiming for what I usually think of as MVPs, meaning in the way I think of it, minimum viable collaborative processes. Okay, so I think my strict focus on MVP collaboration distinguishes IO from many other grand models of design work or models of nature or not models of supposed reality, which I don't really go for. And by the way, just yesterday, Kia Kreutler, who I think, in my opinion, is one of the most eloquent voices in Web3 and in DAO communities, she wrote on Twitter/X, whatever we call it now. She wrote, "The supreme irony of having more predictive models of the world than ever before. While it's likely the future is less predictable than ever before." Nailed it, I think. And I think that this irony is very true, and this irony favors what I personally refer to as lean open protocols for cosmo-localized collaboration. And the main focus of inclusive organizing is this protocol stack that we'll look at, which includes a bunch of different documents, some of which we'll look at directly today. So in this work in general, there's a lot of social theories, certainly, but I'm always striving to create very small modular theories that are meant to be openly explored, openly questioned, practiced, and adjusted or replaced as needed by real projects and communities. I'm not trying to create some unified or centralized system here. There's an emphasis on modularity. Modularity basically means that any systemic relationships here have been sufficiently defined so that a current component or a part of a system could be replaced by many other viable alternatives. And I hope that's clear, and I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with modularity, but we can talk about that in Q&A if anybody wants to. And I also want to emphasize IO is very human-based. Although AI already can do lots of very helpful and harmful things, and we certainly don't know yet exactly where AI is going or the many different places in which it may be going all at once. IO is very strongly based in human agency, which means we can certainly delegate a lot of well-defined tasks to AI systems, and I do at times. But this is very based on human agency and choice. So the structure of IO, it's set up as a series of loosely connected models and modules according to these vertical and horizontal dimensions. I'm not sure if my cursor is showing up very clearly for people at the screen size. I probably should have picked a bigger cursor for the presentation. But vertically, we've got this levels of design conception that shows shared languages, inclusive activities, inclusive governance, and what I now call cosmolocal networking. And this is essentially, horizontally, we've got the levels of design, but then the protocols, the social relationships, and digital tech stack. So each of these four columns vertically creates a sort of technology stack. In the generic sense, the technology stack is shared languages, inclusive activities, inclusive governance, and cosmolocal networking. In protocols, the tech stack goes through specific examples, open source models that I've created, sometimes with help. Open source models that reflect those different levels and sometimes interpenetrate those different levels because this isn't really that linear. And I'll talk about the nonlinearity if there's time later. Social relationships, we don't have time to focus on that much. I like the way I visually designed this, but it's basically about indicating the relationships between persons, between families, teams, and communities that might show up at these different levels of organizing and activities. Now, there's a digital tech stack on the left that reflects my work, mostly in the holochain ecosystem. because I'm very well aware of the great potentials of decentralized and distributed computing to do things more scalably than we can possibly do them through spoken or written processes, even with telecommunications. Computing can have a role, and this digital tech stack reflects that. But my focus today is definitely going to be on the protocols column, which is where most of the IO work has been. And I gotta say, in my view, protocols always can and should come before platforms, and protocols come before apps, because digital platforms of any sort and any type of software application, inherently they create social and technical dependencies. Like, you start using the app and you get used to it. And yes, if it's an open source app, you could fork it and develop your own version of it, if you have the time and the energy, not only to support what's already there, but to fix the bugs and develop it further, etc. Right? So there is a social and technical dependency that is created by using any kind of app. And the degree of dependency, and whether that's a healthy or harmful dependence, I would say it depends greatly on a number of factors, but also on the complexity of the app. Like a big, massive code base with millions of lines of code, that is a huge investment. That is a marriage. That is a very questionable dependency. So I emphasize protocols, which are based on shared verbal understandings, which can be implemented in applications and probably should be at times, but they don't necessarily need to be through any specific application. And I do want to note, apps can become much simpler and more modular than they tend to be. And a good thing too, because like I said, we do need applications to do things at massive scales with big data and relationships with millions of people across the globe. But to make apps simpler and more modular, to reduce the technical dependencies, we need to develop more of these low code and no code approaches, and also see how the role of AI in writing applications evolves, because AI can write applications, but exactly how well will that work and for what purposes, right? So there are a lot of unknowns regarding exactly how much more inclusive the future of apps and platforms may become. But certainly protocols come first from my perspective, and we can always revert to a protocol regardless of which types of applications we've been using. So there's a hierarchy here. There's a vertical dimension, but it's neither a strict dimension, because there's relationships at all levels. And there's also many potential pathways, because frankly, any particular team or project, organization, or a DAO, anyone that would use anything like any of these modules, they might very well start right here, the collective media framework, or they might start with inclusive action recipe or inclusive cultural covenant. They might start even with the markup language, which I'll talk about a bit. There's many potential pathways, and because it's modular, although these modules often relate and refer to each other, they do so in a relatively generic way, such that the role or the function of that module within the other module could be pretty easily and efficiently replaced by a different approach from a different source. So there's this idea that we have levels of design and shared languages, and I'll talk directly about this one, foundations of fractal organizing, because shared languages are absolutely essential, I think, not to interaction or relationship, not even necessary for deep, intimate relationship, but shared languages are essential to doing anything at a very complex level of detail, or with a whole bunch of different participants. We need to develop a shared language to understand and communicate, collaborate, coordinate what we're doing together. And then inclusive activities, I'm going to highlight especially inclusive action recipe, because this is very much the heart of my work recently, where I'm putting most of my attention. And then after that, I'm going to focus, especially to some degree as time allows, I'm going to focus on inclusive cultural covenant, which has also been a big part of my work for 2 to 3 years now. an inclusive governance framework, which is a big container and includes the conception of a collective media framework, which I will also look at. And then there's collective media markup language, which is what it says. It's a markup language, but it's kind of the basis of like the semantic triple structural basis of what is the ultimate outcome in my particular conception, the ultimate outcome of cosmo-localized, massive, large-scale digital networking is the idea of the collective RDF, or the project-based, project-managed, community-managed resource description framework, which includes the idea that any particular project or collective might host a particular media item, but that item each of those items will have its own unique resource identity. And there's also got to be the option to manage and to project manage the development of different editions and different versions of any media items that are of sufficient interest to a community. And this will include the potential to do distributed versioning systems, because that's really important to massive inclusive scalability of inclusive activities and inclusive design processes. So that's my quick overview of the structure of this in general. And like I said, I do want to dive into some of these modules, starting with foundations and then going up the protocol stack to some degree. But I do want to pause now because I've been saying quite a lot, and I'd be happy to field any clarifying questions or comments. Would anybody like to talk? And by the way, I haven't been to one of these presentations, so I get, let me know, please, host people, because there's a couple here. I assume people may just unmute themselves and start talking, right? Is that the standard procedure here? Certainly, I welcome anybody to unmute themselves if they would like to ask any questions or pause. Just let me know quick, and otherwise, I will continue with foundations of fractal organizing. Okay, so I already opened that up, didn't I? All right, foundations of fractal organizing has become I would say, the technical basis of most of my work. This has been certainly my main technical work for over a year now. And this is based directly on my practical experiences in starting, for the first time in my life in the last 12 to 18 months, to build relational databases for work. Meaning, and relational databases, for those not very familiar with DB technology, it just means databases that are built out of tables and the relationships between tables. And it includes Airtable, which a lot of people are very familiar with, includes CODA, which is pretty similar to Airtable, and I do a lot of work in CODA. So foundations of fractal organizing is meant to be a very general foundational ontology or foundational concepts for modeling and mapping any describable things, literally, in my thinking, including all concepts, all phenomena, entities, and systems, including all people, all projects, all resources, etc. This is meant to be very flexibly useful, okay? And there's navigational details here. And of course, you can access this document. It's hyperlinked conspicuously. Well, maybe not that conspicuously, but right at the base of inclusive organizing here, right? And when you access it, if you take a look at it, there is a supplementary materials document, and there's a navigational guide here. Because this is a lot of work. It's very conceptually dense. It has a lot of subsections and a lot of structure. So obviously there's not time for us to look at it closely today, but I can give you the overview more or less of what fractal organizing is, or modular organizing as it was previously called, and why I've build it the way that I've built it so far. So foundations is a set of irreducible root terms or ontological primitives, as we would often say in computer and software engineering. Flexibly useful for modeling and mapping anything which can be modeled and mapped, in my opinion. A special emphasis on the design, development, and governance of what I call governable resources, because not all resources can be governed, like mental resources, like you have a thought or I have a thought, an idea, a dream, a hope, a vision, or whatever. Nobody can control that or govern it unless it's your own personal one and you think you're actually in control of all of your thoughts, etc. And then maybe you think you're the governor of it. But I think of in terms of some resources being clearly governable, such as communications protocols, projects, network systems, and databases. And there's a big emphasis in foundations on laying out this basic terminology or ontology that we can use fractally or scalably or holographically or whatever you want to call it, to use a fairly small set of root terms that can be used to describe anything at any level of complexity, any level of hierarchical or peer-to-peer or other types of unique relationships. So these ontological primitives have a core category structure of networking primitives, systems primitives, resource primitives, functional media primitives, and then a deeper description and linkage section, which gets relatively technical and detailed. So networking primitives, as I've defined them, and they are very generic and typical. Like if you look at these concepts, element, trait, type, set, link, etc. These are pretty normal concepts. If you look up different theories of digital networking or other types of networking, you'll see that my definitions are pretty intentionally conventional.
Sorry, I
Yes.
think we are still on the first, like we are, I'm not sure we are watching the same you are.
Oh, no.
Yeah, we are still in the first
I'm
slide.
not used to Google. It didn't switch. I'm so sorry. Present something else. Thank you so much for interjecting that. Wow. My apologies. This is the first time I've given a public presentation with Google Meet. Can you see
Yeah, no,
the
it's okay.
document
Yeah.
now? Thank you so much. I didn't realize I needed to manually switch the tab. Makes sense. Okay, so Foundations of Fractal Organizing is this document. And as I was saying, it's heavily structured, heavily detailed. So on the left side, you'll see a table of contents that runs a couple pages long. There's a lot of sections and subsections. All right. And as I said, there's a navigation guide and there is a supplementary materials document, which includes all of the notes, which would be endnotes if they were in the same document. It includes a lot of other supplementary sections. So then I went into the overview when I didn't realize that I wasn't screen sharing properly as of yet. And the overview indicates the general structure of networking primitives, systems primitives, resource primitives, functional media primitives, and deeper description and linkage, which is a relatively detailed and complex section. So the networking primitives, as I was saying before, they're very generic and kind of conventional definitions, but I've created a very small set of these definitions and I've defined them pretty strictly so that I think they can be versatilely used. And certainly I've conducted quite a lot of thought experiments as well as practical implementations of this to use them to map all types of concepts and phenomena. And they serve as the basis, these networking primitives, of the systems primitives and of the resource primitives, and then the functional media primitives. Okay. So going to systems primitives, this is stuff a lot of y'all are probably pretty familiar with, being in Web3 and DAOs and other systems thinking contexts. There's a big emphasis on the REA primitives or REA data modeling and mapping. Give a credit to William McCarthy for this in the early 80s, and also some of my personal influences, value flows, and some of the other projects that are in the holochain and in other ecosystems. A lot of them use REA, resource event agent modeling, because it makes a lot of sense. We're creating decentralized or distributed or cosmo-localized systems, right? Because REA primitives were for historically, they were for moving from enterprise resource planning into network resource planning, which is not entirely controlled by a specific company. So REA primitives are simply conceptions of what a resource and an event and an agent are. And I've included a subtype of event here, meeting. But these definitions of resource, event, and agent, although very carefully considered, they are pretty darn close to the historical definitions in William McCarthy's models and value flows, etc. An agent is a person, entity, organization, or aligns with decision-making authority, meaning an agent can be a person, it can also be a group agent, it can be a project, it can be a company or a corporation if it's defined sufficiently. Jumping back up to resource, and I often go in these out of order because this is an agent-centric model. Resource is any entity, item, energy, or energy source which is useful within a clearly identifiable context. So this is an intentionally very generic and flexible definition, and I'm not trying to get into any potentially distracting and inefficient debate about, for example, is an agent ever a resource or not? I would say that depends on context, because yeah, actually a project or an organization can be a resource. It might actually be a healthy, a just, a fair resource to put in your system, in your modeling. It's not necessarily exploitative to think of a project or a company as being a resource if it performs a valuable function inside of some other project or inside of a community. The important thing to note about that is that while some agents, such as projects and organizations, can be resources in some contexts, it's not cool to refer to people as resources. Don't do that. Now, we can refer to the roles that people perform within a specific project or organization as being a resource, right? You define a role of like a facilitator, or a project manager, or an event manager, or a janitor, or somebody who does the gardening, etc. Any type of role that you can define, any kind of function that somebody might perform in an organization, that's a role. That's something that could potentially be a role that could potentially be transferred from one person to another. And the role is a resource, but the person that chooses voluntarily to perform that role is not a resource. They are someone who is acting in a specific capacity. Okay. So resources and agents are super important in trying to define and develop systems. Events are too, because events are any identifiable action, interaction, activity, or change, which, as I define it, happens either at a very specific time or during a defined period of time. And that is meant to be very flexible. A lot of events are very precise, like, oh, well, the clock is ticking, therefore every time it ticks is a specific second. But another event, like a multi-day conference, obviously, that's an event that starts and ends on different days. And other events may go on much longer than that too, many years even. But this definition of event is meant to be extremely generic and flexible, along with resource and agent definitions for modeling any kinds of systems. So I'm going to try to breeze through the key aspects of foundations pretty quickly, because there's a lot of other documents I want to show too, at least briefly. But talking about systems, we perceive and model or define relationships between resources, events, and agents, right? And one of the ways we do that is defining processes. A process is an event or an activity which, as I define it, generates one or more specific resources. That might be a bit of an unusual definition. There's a very good reason for it. So feel free to check this out and ask any questions about it. A system is a network, which was previously defined, which can very simply perform one or more specific processes, meaning a system is any network which can predictably generate one or more specific resources. And this is probably one of the most generic and flexible definitions of system that you are likely to come across, very expansive and flexible. This includes all highly specialized, complex, and adaptive systems, such as organisms and organizations, including all DAOs. It also includes, this definition of system flexibly includes all models and a limitless diversity of process-performing networks, many of which are very simple and mostly inconsequential or unnoticed. And that's fine. We don't have to think much about whether something is or isn't a system. But if we can think about something in a way that we recognize that there's some sort of output from that, it is a system, and we can look as closely at that system as we need to. Okay, so systems have functions and they have components, and a component performs functions inside of a system, noting that the system as a whole also performs a function or performs a process, but the component operates within that system, even if it's not enclosed by or controlled by that system, because we can often perform processes and a whole bunch of different systems that are independent or autonomous sovereign systems, right? So that's the idea of systems primitives here. Now, that's all pretty conventional, except that it leads in a certain direction for developing very methodically scalable and fractal or holographic, using the exact same tool set at all levels of hierarchy. It's very customized to do that. Resource primitives, I've defined mental resources, physical resources in fairly general ways. Mental resource includes the concept of identity per se, but later on in this document, there's the concept of identifier. Identifier is down here as a subsection of functional media primitives. Governance resource identifier includes things in digital systems, such as your email address or your unique user profile, etc. So anyway, resource primitives have these general categories such as mental, physical, and media resource, which media resources are by far the main focus of foundations, because media resources are the basis of us doing very massively scalable global activities that are inclusive, that are cosmo-localized. So media resources, there's some fairly conventional definitions for sign, signal, stream, message, etc. Now, the definitions for media channel, the definition for media channel is very it's distinctive and it's very important. And we don't have time to talk about that much today, but I will allow time certainly during the conversation. And I've only got about 16 minutes left, so I know I need to get through this a little quicker. Media channel is very distinctive and important to this entire conception. So these are media resources. We're talking about the way media resources are actually like fundamentally structured or created here when we're talking about sign signals, media channels, and media links. So there's a section called functional media primitives, which is not about how media resources are created or structured per se. It's about what they do. And what they do, I think, is that they are either models or more often maps. And I've created this major emphasis on models or maps that function as governance resources, which includes all identifiers, topics, issues, goals, plans, including all protocols, programs, all policies, all designed tasks, all planned events, proposals and projects, roles. Roles include core governance roles that are very generic, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when I move on to the next document. Channel roles regarding digital media, particularly these different channel roles. When we look at them very granularly, we can develop my conception of what I call granulated governance, in which we are within a particular project or a group of people. We try to be as transparent and open about how the permissions and the roles are distributed as possible, and we develop systems that enable those roles to be redistributed dynamically and as inclusively and fairly as possible. So there's a lot more here, and I'm not doing a great job of describing it very briefly at the outer space overview level. Like I said before, deeper description and linkages is very detailed, and I wasn't planning to talk about that today anyway, so we'll get away from that. But all right, so foundations of modular organizing. Again, this is my main technical work for some years. Sorry, I called it modular organizing because the title keeps changing from modular to fractal. It could also be called foundations of scalable systems, is a direction I lean towards sometimes. That might be a little more obviously intelligible to a lot of the intended audience. Scalable systems. It's true. That's very much what this is meant to be. So that's an effort to develop language for linked data, for semantic links, for databases of all types that function in large or massive communities, including all of the uses in which decentralized platforms use big data, which they usually use graph databases or document-based databases or key value databases for, etc. I got to be careful with my screen share. Make sure I go to the right tab. Let's see. Present something else. All right. So let's get to inclusive action recipe, which I already have open in a tab here, and make sure that shows up. This is the main emphasis of my work recently, and this is probably the last thing I'm going to be able to talk about at any length today. Before I do, would anybody like to comment or ask any questions? Well, I appreciate your rapt interest in me attempting.
I have a tiny
Yeah,
comment just to shout out Ben Life and going back to this linked open wisdom commons thing that was sort of flurrying some time back, but carry on and let's see if we get an exchange at the end.
Okay.
Cheers.
Yeah, and I guess these sessions, there's usually a 30-minute networking thing afterwards, right? And I'll be able to stick around a while for that, so that's pretty helpful. Yeah, thank you, Charles. So inclusive action framework has been around since 2015, but I recently redid the diagram because this has become so central and so important to me recently. Yeah, it's the main thing that I've been working on because it really crystallized for me in my team projects, etc., how important it is to me to use this sort of conception of the personal process, the inner dialogue, experience, and representation that occurs that feeds into our social activities with each other. And those social activities I define as being kind of this interlocked cycle of doing, discussing, designing, and deciding. And I think all four of these are deeply intertwined and closely related to each other, although I would strongly suggest that inclusive doing and inclusive discussion or inclusive dialogue, these are very much the heart of inclusive activity. Because inclusive design is also important, but often we're designing things that eventually we need to make a decision or take a vote upon, etc. And that's also very important, but I kind of downplay the role of voting and of official decision-making in general, even though quite a lot of my work has been over the years in decision processes, just partly because I've been doing a lot of that. I recognize the limitations of formal processes, but they are super important when they happen. It's just that creating inclusive activities and inclusive doing in practice. And inclusive discussions is really the heart of that feeds into all inclusive design and decision making. And when we have these inclusive activities, doing, discussing, designing, deciding, sometimes there's an output of decision making into a collective resource, whether it's just an agreement between two people, or maybe it's the founding constitution or the founding foundational agreement of a massive global organization or company, right? I call these collective resources. And the collective resources are part of the outer level here, which is like the social support systems. Because when you're trying to have an inclusive, cosmo-localized community, you're trying to support all of this inclusive doing, discussing, designing, deciding, but there's going to be conflict. There's going to be a lot of differences of opinion. There's going to be all kinds of tensions. Often they're very creative and productive tensions. But there's got to be some sort of way of exploring tension, exploring stress and conflict, and resolving it or transforming it into something else. And hopefully everybody comes out ahead through that process, that we've all learned something, and the community has actually gotten greater and stronger because we went through a challenging experience together. Well, when we have stresses and tensions, we do need social support systems, which are the outer circle here. And that includes collective resources, because if you have, for example, a policy such as inclusive cultural covenant, which is one of the other IO modules, or any type of cultural covenant or code of conduct or community agreement, whatever you call it, that policy, and also any other policies that your project or your team has, those serve as part of your social support system, because they are existing ideas and existing plans for how to deal with things, such as, conflict resolution. But collective resources are only one of the 5 components here in the social support system, and you're not required to go, directly to the collective resources when you're trying to deal with tension and to create a great outcome. You could also go straight to personal support, a trusted peer, etc. And you could go straight to team support if you don't happen to have a personal trusted associate in a team. Maybe you're in a new place, you go straight to the team. You can also go straight to the community, depending on the social context. But more often you might use a subsidiarity or a escalating scales of engagement, right? Going like from personal to team to community support. And of course, there's also the opportunity for external support in dire extreme emergencies or some kind of horrific crisis. And that external support could come through a different project or a person that has nothing to do with that team or group. It could come through some kind of governmental agency or law enforcement or a mutual aid network or something else more progressive. But that's the idea here, is that we always have these inner sense-making experience, personal sense-making that feeds into our hopefully inclusive activities, doing, discussing, designing, sometimes deciding and adding to our collective resources or updating a collective resource. And the collective resources, along with personal and team and community support, hopefully resolve most of our creative tensions and opportunities to get stronger and better and more fit as a community. But we also have that option to go externally in need. So that's the idea, the general idea of inclusive action framework, but there is a link here to a written explanation. And this is really the do, discuss, design, decide cycle, or what I call 4D development, is where most of my attention has been recently. I'm really working hard on this, and it takes time because it's the idea of trying to develop a really scalable, collectively intelligent design system, a peer-to-peer system that can allow for massive inputs from a whole bunch of people to analyze what we want to do together, and why, etc., and to collect source media, anything that would be useful in that, to harvest that source media, and from that harvest or from further reflections and conversations to collect the desired features of a product or a design, a prototype, and together as a community analyze those desired features, regardless of who contributed a suggestion, to analyze them as being wants, needs, or things that we can't or shouldn't have according to each person's perspective, to develop a scalable ratings or metric system for dealing with this, to develop the specification of the prototype, and to develop a modular prototype, etc. So there's a lot to that, and I know I'm running out of time, but that is, like I said, my main focus lately is inclusive action recipe, and that's it really is the heart of inclusive organizing from my perspective, and that's why it is visually emphasized a bit. It serves to support all the other ideas, including things that I won't have time to talk about today. I'm both sorry and not sorry about that, I guess, because yeah, there's so much worth talking about. Inclusive cultural covenant has been a big part of my work for years because the way I think of it, inclusive technology requires inclusive culture. And we need to have talks about what inclusive culture means. And I often do have these talks. And if anybody takes a look at inclusive cultural covenant, they're going to see very specific, let's see, let me switch my screen share really briefly to wrap this up because it is so important from my perspective. So inclusive cultural covenant is a relatively detailed and very structured and methodical approach to managing or facilitating or moderating a community. And it is very structured in terms of promoting certain concepts like freedom of expression, confidentiality, self-determination, having a pledge of community, which is kind of the standard set of guidelines, the driving vision of the community, but also a very clearly distinguished list of prohibited actions. And that it would include a harassment and abuse policy in most cases, and conflict resolution regarding violations, and defining violations as being either the performance of prohibited actions or these other very specific definitions. So this is all very structured and it's pretty detailed, and it's because a lot of my work for a decade now has been in online community management. So there's reasons why I've developed this in the way that I have, so that we don't need to depend on admins and moderators having great personal judgment, because frankly, all of us are biased and we all have priorities. And sometimes we would overlook the behaviors of our friends or people who are very allied with us in a specific group. This is meant to not to deny the inherent inevitability of subjectivity, but to downplay the role of subjectivity, to offload most of the process into a standard operating procedure that is relatively well-defined and efficient. So that's the idea in this document. And yeah, I know we're like at the top of the hour. That was about half of the stuff that I was hoping to go through. Going back briefly to the main diagram, inclusive governance framework is a big container, but it's based on inclusive cultural covenant. And includes collective media framework, which is an idea of how to develop a potentially massive global media network that is well governed and fairly decentralized, managed, moderated, administered. That leads into collective media markup language, which, okay, I'm going to run over by about a minute. This is kind of the key takeaway in a lot of technical, like Web3 contexts, et cetera, is collective media markup language. This is about creating, and it's kind of based, or it's being redefined or reinforced by the development of foundations of fractal organizing, which I described earlier. but it's very much about creating metadata and creating structured feedback, rating systems, ways for people to give the feedback that's either very coarse or very finely grained feedback on comments other people have made or media items of whatever sorts that are part of the discussion forum or the chat server or the project's collective resources, etc. So this is relatively philosophical and abstract at times, as it needs to be. A lot of it's about evaluative rating scales of different types. It also includes a lot of ideas on how structured conversation can be further developed. And that feeds into the main diagram where I need to end. At the top of the main diagram, and thank you all for your patience, is collective RDF. And there's a document for that, but it's also right in the diagram here. Kind of the idea of collective RDF, and I touched on this initially early on, is the idea that we as collectives or as organizations or projects, we can develop a massive media network using either collective media framework or something that performs similar functions. And we can manage, we can be the hosts of specific media items, which each of them is a resource. And we can also develop a system of developmental staging or pre-production for different editions and versions or edition plus version of each media item. And we can attach metadata like ratings and feedback, peer-to-peer feedback, etc., to any part of all of this process, including like we could create a selection within a specific pre-production edition of something and say, okay, that's a terrible idea, or, oh, that's an awesome idea, we must put that into the final product, etc. So collective RDF is kind of the idea of how this looks in terms of structuring media items, editions and versions, etc., in a way that they're very interoperable and portable, not just within a massive media network, but to be interoperably shared with different people, projects, different organizations, etc. So thank you all for listening to me being very long-winded and looking quickly at a lot of that. Like I said, you can look at this diagram and the linked documents anytime you'd like. Please note there's an explanatory link here. And a lot of these documents have explanatory sections and subsections. But more importantly, these are all just, you know, my ideas and also ideas that have come to me through Teamworks. But where do we go from here? You know, I don't expect any person or project, no matter how cool any of this does or doesn't look to you, I don't expect anybody to like adopt this whole thing or even any of the big modules within it wholeheartedly. I'm very much in favor of this, what I said earlier, an MVP or minimum viable collaborative process, where we can look at ideas and interests that each person has and draw them from any sources. In my case, I'll draw some of my ideas from the documents I've developed, but we can draw them from any other sources and build small to increasingly large teams that work together to transform networking standards, to transform open protocols, to transform the way apps and sometimes maybe even software platforms are developed, to transform the way that decisions are made in DAOs and how we learn slowly but surely, I think, to cosmolocally and inclusively organize together. That's my mission. Thank you for staying on several minutes.
Thank you, Greg. Do you have a few minutes to answer any questions?
I sure do. I can stay until past the hour.
Okay. If anyone wants to ask a question, go ahead and unmute. Thank you. And if we have a few, we can raise our hands.
It's kind of so vast, it's hard to like jump in on one part because, like you said, like you're not expecting people to take the whole thing exactly.
Right. yeah, I wouldn't want anyone to feel pressure to focus on one part. I mean, you could flip a coin, or I sometimes use a dice rolling app when I'm faced with some very arbitrary decision, right? Like I don't have any reasonable way to select between several different options, and sometimes I'll just roll a die instead. Yes. Hey, Benjamin.
Hi, Greg. Amazing presentation. My question is about how we might be able to work with this framework and integrate it into the open protocol library. What we've been working on has been our best attempt to create a very similar kind of pattern language. And we're describing it as a pattern language for social organisms, taking this kind of nested holonic view of self-organization. And so I'm curious how you might imagine this kind of approach being potentially adapted as kind of an underlying pattern language for something like a protocol library, to start kind of categorizing and sorting different kind of composable and interoperable functions within this kind of approach to inclusive governance, and how you might see us being able to collaborate moving forward.
Greg, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Great framing. Thank you, Benjamin. I guess the quick and easy way to answer that is just to take any and all of this as you want, particularly because it's open sourced, and you can copy, paste, or link, etc., and or you can throw it into the blender. You can adopt anything anywhere you want to. Of course, I'd love to be in conversation, though. I have a great deal of interest in all of this, and also I have a great deal of interest in what the open protocols, what the library ends up looking like. So I would love to look at what you all have so far, and look at what I have, and compare and contrast, and to use any kind of process for integrating in either or both directions, right? And see what matches and doesn't. And sometimes there's probably going to be merging and diverging of certain like components because the format is probably different. But there's a lot of ways to approach that. And I think a lot of it could come through live dialogue. And it's very much in my interest to have that dialogue, because, yeah, this was a whirlwind tour, obviously. And frankly, any one of the major components that are directly linked in the inclusive organizing diagram, any one of them is very worthy of discussing for at least an hour, I'm sure, even if it's just a one-on-one conversation. So I would like to follow up on that, Benjamin, through direct conversation and/or asynchronous processes, such as, feel free to take anything and link it or copy and paste per se, whatever works. But also let's talk about it and see what happens. And maybe there could be some very direct collaboration, I'm sure, because I'm looking for an all doors approach to outreach, grassroots, top down approaches to adapting and integrating tiny or large components in different ways, and such that they end up in different projects and in different containers ultimately, as long as those containers don't, of course, turn into very extractive or exploitative containers, which I know that won't happen with you. And that's probably true with most of the people that would be interested, thankfully, in working with me. So let's see what happens.
Thank you. If I could ask a brief follow-up,
Yeah.
I'm getting flashbacks to different collaborative contexts that we've been in over the years, and we first met in 2018 or 19, I believe. And you were already 5 or 10 years in at that point. So I really respect your dedication and the continuity of the focus that you've brought to this work. And you were one of the first people to really introduce me to holochain and agent-centric design philosophy. So I want to thank you publicly for that. And then also Charles is here on the call. And we were in another collaborative context where that was also around linked data and commoning and creating open source libraries. And what I have found as a kind of perennial design challenge is the need for a kind of upper ontology or taxonomic like distinctions of categories to be able to sort information. But I found that various times that I've attempted to do that, I've kind of boxed myself in with the taxonomies that I've created, where a truly universal upper ontology may not exist. It might be oppressive to insinuate. And so I think a lot of this comes from studying organic processes, because there's this kind of immanent, self-evident nature of them that makes it slightly more trustable to me to say, okay, this might be how nature operates. And so I'm curious, from a process level, how did you come to this kind of ontology, and how can it be used across contexts or adapted so that it doesn't become kind of fixed top down, but allows for the emergence of kind of a folksonomy, but also provides the affordances of a kind of top down ontology?
That's great. And I know, Charles, you have your hand up. So Charles, would you like to add to that before I reply, or after?
Well, thanks. Yeah, I guess I'll add briefly, and just dovetail back to you, Greg. But Benjamin, you may recall, because this is like, and Greg too, perhaps already a couple of years ago when we spoke, I was thinking about this thing I call the minimum viable ontology, and I just wanted to bring that in. It's just a playful term. There's more to it, and I don't want to take too much time here, but it's like the ontology of the moment, sort of the snapshot of now, and how to get to the next phase and the next version of the ontology. But at any given time, there's a kind of this is like internally how I just come to organize my own stuff. And maybe that's useful. I think so. I didn't really formulate it properly yet. Check.
Cool. And so from my perspective, because I've been focused very much on foundations of fractal organizing in a technical sense for over a year of refining and reiterating, I have a very strong opinion that what I've developed with these networking primitives, systems primitives, resource primitives, and the functional media primitives, that this truly is a minimum viable ontology, according to all of my personal check boxes. But of course, that doesn't really mean anything unless that works in practice in relationship with other people and projects, right? It works great in my databases so far for Recurve and, in association with Commons Engine. But it needs to be tested, tried, and adapted. And it comes back to that inclusive action framework and inclusive culture, I think, and open sourcing, because yes, there is an ontology here that has a lot of structure in terms of 4 main sections and like 40 to 50 key terms here, these ontological primitives. But the exact phrasing of each of these primitives, like the name that I've chosen for them, etc., obviously that can be adapted or changed or forked by anybody that wants to. Number one, just legally speaking, because it's an open source document. Number two, because I want it to evolve and to be adapted or customized for different people's and projects. I don't want anyone to impose some sort of like universal language in any sense. I mean, hell, all of this is an English language ontology right there. That's very biased, obviously. Sorry, it's the only way that I can develop an ontology, because it's the only language that I'm fluent in. But yeah, it needs to be adapted. Terms can be changed. And people may find, and I may be one of those people that find, when we practice together and we look at defining everything as being like resources, events, and agents who perform processes, and we develop systems, and the systems are sometimes sometimes governed by a specific project or a specific organization, and those organizations have specific, constitutional policies, and they have assigned and unassigned roles within them, etc. And they develop these structures that may be more or less centralized, more or less distributed and inclusive, but they may find that some of these terms are either insufficient or inappropriate for what they're trying to do. My view is that actually all of these terms would be applicable in any sufficiently complex system, but the vast majority of people and projects wouldn't need to use more than a handful of them. But like I said, to just develop the ontology in a way that is not oppressive, that requires both culture and technique. It requires a genuine desire to work together, to cosmo-localize, to take something that's open source and to adapt it cosmo-locally for each specific project. And it requires the technique of copying, pasting, forking, adapting, having some sort of like developmental staging system for how we develop a prototype and iterate that, and how do we come up with our proposals, and if and need be, when do we launch an active proposal inside of a governance system, and what's the standard for, hopefully a consent-based standard for getting a proposal turned into an agreement within a project, etc. So there's a lot to this, obviously, a lot of details to how we govern inclusively and in a way that is not oppressive, and it doesn't like pull everybody to the same thing, I guess. But I guess my view is that something like this is going to become the general minimum viable ontology, even regardless of whether any of it comes from me or anybody I know, regardless of what each of these terms is called or what language they're called this in. To me, it actually is a super flexible ontology, but that has to be proven in each relationship.
Brilliant answer. Thank you so much for your time and attention and for fielding those. And thank you for hosting this incredible conversation, Local DAO Summer Crew.
Yeah, thanks so much to our hosts. That's wonderful. Thank you for helping to move the conversation in that direction, Benjamin. That actually was part of my closing notes, some of that, my response to you. I ran over time, so I'm very grateful that you touched on some of the other items that I was interested in. And we still have about 10 minutes. I think that the hosts can stay. The hosts can keep the room open until 1:30. Is that right? Yeah, thank you. So with that in mind, anybody else feel free to jump in with anything that seems even remotely relevant. Also, if nobody does jump in, I can add a little bit regarding foundations of modular organizing, because I didn't get to focus on that. I focused on that more than anything else, but it was still pretty brief. I actually gave a MetaGov seminar presentation for about 42 minutes on foundations about a month ago, I think. And that was also rushed, just talking about nothing other than foundations. I still ran over time. So the key point or the highlights of foundations, and I alluded to this briefly, I mentioned that the media channel definition is very distinctive, but also the media item definition is particularly distinctive. Foundation, and this is not intuitive, I don't think, but I think it's important. Media item is defined in Foundation as being a specific message, which is, maybe I should screen share since I'm bringing this up, even if it's just for a minute. This definition is, a media item is a specific message which is mutually determinable and practically identical for everyone within an identifiable social context. So that's a very geeky and perhaps abstract looking and non-intuitive definition. But I've spent many, many hours defining and redefining this term to come to this point, for whatever it may or may not be worth. And this document talks a little bit about it. It says it's unusually subtle and technical, and that links to a note in the supplementary document here, that it's subtle and inherently relational. And certainly this sort of definition, it's totally unnecessary for media items in traditional physical media, because like, if you have a book, you can pick it up and you say, okay, this is the media item. It's this book. It's got covers. It's got a certain number of pages. They're in between the covers, so it's well contained, identified. You know, that's kind of the history of media before telecommunications and digital networking. But as I think about distributed data, linked data, semantic links, and big data relationships, defining media items became more challenging and also perhaps more interesting, because I found that so far that this definition enables us to sufficiently design, develop, and govern decentralized digital media items, regardless of what those items represent, because a lot of our media is very representational, right? We have a project description. That project description represents a project. Etc. But it's important for the media items to be sufficiently well defined, and for us to be able to link them to the media channels which determine, influence, or are influenced by their contents. Because when we have digital media items, well, the digital media item may change. Like if it's a Google Doc, it might change daily. But the current identity and the current contents of that digital media item are actually determined by a configuration of media channels, such as the group of people that are able to edit the media item. We need to eventually to really be analytical and identify, okay, this is a digital media item because certain people are able to add or subtract to the current digital data that is inside of a container, that we can all identify exactly what the container is, and we're all able to determine what's in that container right now, in a way that the content is mutually practically identical to everybody involved. So this is very important when we're thinking about like blockchains and holochain, which is not at all equivalent to traditional blockchains. Holochain is about cosmolocalized data, really, although I've never said that before. I only embraced the term cosmolocal like a couple weeks ago, even though I've known about it for many years. So yeah, holochain is about cosmolocalization, because it's not about creating a blockchain that says, okay, this is the ledger that is the global ledger. This is the sole source of truth regarding a history of interactions or transactions among potentially millions or billions of people, right? Traditional blockchains are meant to scale up to that level of massive data organization or data determination. Well, holochain can do that, but it's not focused on it. It's focused on cosmolocalizing, really. It's about any particular group of peers or teammates mutually determining the data that they work with. And if it's just two people, they can mutually determine that together. And it doesn't need to be verified by somebody else, except in a case of conflict resolution, right? In which case you would look at the source. But it is cosmolocalization. And at the same time, because holochains have this relationality, there isn't a single source of data across an entire holochain at a given point in time. But there is actually a mutually determinable media item within each important relationship. inside a holochain interaction or a holochain based project at a given point in time, because there is kind of a local network of people who are mutually responsible for the data that enters the chain. So that's pretty technical and wonky, but some of y'all probably get the general gist of it, that it is actually cosmo-localized data, and therefore it creates what I would and do call a media item that is of importance, such as like, oh, this is our current active official policy within our project. Well, that is, even if it's just a digital item, and it's a digital item that's been generated through a holochain or some other form of decentralized computing technology, it is nonetheless a clearly definable message, a particular combination of data, which is mutually determinable and practically identical for everybody that is a peer in that holochain. So that's a kind of wonky way to approach the fact that this document, although much of it's very conventional, there are some very distinctive definitions, especially this media item definition, which, as I see it, make it a very generically flexible ontology for developing data structures and granulated governance of relationships of all sorts, including hierarchies of like massive communities and support teams and sub teams, et cetera, for those communities, to some types of, if and when there is some sort of fair, just, efficient bureaucracy. And I do think bureaucracy, depending on definitions, it can be fair and just at times. You know, it's just a question of the ingredients involved, including the people that perform functions within that bureaucracy. We can develop hierarchy of all sorts, including bureaucracies, and we can develop partnerships between different people and projects, pointing in all directions. So we end up with uncountable numbers of connections between people and projects, right? In the data that's distributed between different people, regardless of whether they're using holochain or some other type of decentralized networking. And we can use functional media primitives that are based on media items that are mutually determinable. And we can say, every one of us that it really matters to, we can say, yes, this person has this identifier, or maybe it's a unique identifier, such as like Greg S. number 7 or whatever, within a specific namespace when it comes to identifiers. We can also say there's a very specific topic, a media item, or issue, goal, plan, or a policy, such as our community agreement, that everybody, whether it's a small group of people or a massive group of people, they can all say, yes, this is the thing, regardless of whether or not it's decentralized, regardless of whether or not we edit it on a fairly frequent basis. We can all point to the same instance of that item being the official active policy. And that's really important to me. A few minutes in case anybody else wants to talk.
Thanks so much, Greg. Great to see you and hear you.
You too, Charles. Hope we can catch up.
Yeah, I think I have the same thought that Benjamin was having in terms of open civics, like with regard to the network adaptive organisms. Maybe we can do some lay out on the table stuff.
That would be great. Yeah. Yeah, and okay. I don't know if you have. I know that Benjamin's been in conversation with Fernanda Ibarra, who is also my main design partner. So there's going to be a lot of different things to talk about in different contexts. And by the way, Fernanda is one of the many people in projects. So if I had not felt such a time rush, I would have been pointing very specifically towards in my credits. But like I said, there's credits attached to a lot of these documents, including some credits to her and to Value Flows and to other groups and people.
Okay, great. Great to know. Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose we all got to close the room any minute now. Thanks once again to Ethereal Forest, and greatly appreciate the opportunity and looking forward to the conversations coming.